Thank you so much for joining our second election-themed webinar in actually 2 days. We're now just a few days away from what I call a momentous occasion. The U.S. presidential election is dominating the discussions, not just in the U.S., but all over the world, including right here in Korea. Yesterday, we had a very meaningful conversation with Kyung La of CNN on the media aspect of the election. Kyung, I thought, did a fantastic job walking us through her insights from the views of CNN. Today, I am really thrilled to host two of Washington's most outstanding experts in foreign policy. I also consider them as close friends to me personally, and of course to AMCHAM. Despite their really busy schedules, we are so honored that Dr. John Hamre and Dr. Victor Cha of CSIS have joined us. Of all the relationships that AMCHAM has in DC, I consider our relationship with CSIS to be one of the most important. Dr. Hamre is the president and CEO of CSIS. And I gotta tell you, he has interviewed more sitting heads of state than anyone I know, and is probably the most knowledgeable person in this universe. Dr. Cha is well known to everyone in Korea, including North Korea. So whatever is going on in the world, we can always count on Dr. Hamre and Dr. Cha for their insights and analysis without the politics. Unfortunately, the COVID situation has prevented us from hosting Dr. Hamre and Dr. Cha in person, which is a shame. However, I'm so glad that we can have this dialogue today in a virtual format with a broader audience of AMCHAM members and colleagues. I want to let you know we have a tremendous turnout today, which shows the high relevance of this event, as well as the high value of the expertise offered by Dr. Hamre and Dr. Cha. So for those of you who are in the audience, please feel free to jump in with some questions and comments at any time using the Q&A function. So in the interest of time, let me go straight to the fireside chat. So John and Victor, the election is less than what, 5-6 days away. Mm-hmm. And maybe we can start with you, John. What is the mood in Washington, D.C.?
Well, first, James, thank you. I mean, it's such a privilege to have a chance to be with you and AMCHAM. I mean, every time we go to Korea, the biggest priority I have is have a chance to schedule time with you and your colleagues to learn. And I've learned so much from you all, and it's been so invaluable. And I want to say thank you. And let me also just say honestly how proud I am of how well Korea has handled COVID. You know, I'm embarrassed to say America has done quite poorly. You know, it's rising again. We probably have 260,000 people, you know, now that will have died from this. It's tragic. And I look at Korea, and Korea has done so well. It shows that a democracy can handle a pandemic. You know, I mean, I thank you for the model. I really thank you for the model. It's great. You asked, what's the mood here? Well, I mean, first of all, everybody's really tired. You know, we're so anxious to have this election over. This has been going on now for, you know, a year and a half, almost 2 years, and we're really tired of it. It's clear that this is a pretty pivotal election on how Americans think about their own future domestically, and then their role in the world. And it's a choice between kind of two alternative visions. President Trump has a vision that America should be focusing on itself and put its own priorities first. Vice President Biden has a more traditional view that America is stronger when it has allies and friends, and it's actively working in the world. So we have two very different visions. But you know, right now we're just counting the days until we can get the election.
Yeah. How about you, you know, Victor? I'm sure you have a lot of interesting views on DC right now.
Yeah, well, thanks, James. I also want to thank you and AmCham for hosting this fireside chat tonight here in Washington, D.C. this morning in Seoul. Of course, it's an honor to be on the screen with my boss, Dr. Hamre. And James, it's good
Take all
to
the
see you. I
time
haven't
you
seen
need here.
It's James, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you in person in a while, and I always enjoy hanging out with you when we're in Korea together. So, so thanks. I think, you know, I think the way John described it is right. I mean, I think it's a combination of anticipation and exhaustion. People are anticipating this election, the most important election, certainly in my lifetime, for the United States and its direction. But there's also a lot of exhaustion over the pandemic, you know, exhaustion over the, you know, frankly, Trump and his behavior. I think there's just people are really, really tired. And so everybody's looking forward to next week so that we can, you know, that we can finally move on.
Well, great. Thank you so much. And, you know, it's a privilege for me to ask some of these questions to both of you. So let me get to some of the heat of the question. You know, Victor, you know so much about South Korea and obviously North Korea as well. And I think that, you know, you've noted that North Korea tends to step up provocations before and after the US elections. So far, it's been pretty calm, I think. So what is the significance of this calmness?
So I think the calmness may be for one of two reasons, or they could be for both reasons. One is that there's a lot going on domestically inside of North Korea right now. You know, they had what, 8 typhoons this season. All 3 of the major rivers flooded over. Most of the irrigated land has been washed away. So they have major flooding. They have major food problems because of a bad harvest. COVID, although North Korea says they have no COVID, they're clearly concerned about it. And they've shut down their border with China to try to stop it, which is probably the most severe trade sanction that's ever been imposed on North Korea, has been self-imposed by shutting down the border with China. So I think Fitch predicted North Korea's economic growth rate is going to decline by over 8% this year, which is the largest decline since the famine in the mid-1990s. So I think there's a lot of internal focus. The other is, I think they're also waiting to see the outcome of this election. I think that if Trump wins this election, North Korea will almost immediately look for another meeting with Trump to try to make a deal right away. However, if Biden wins, it wouldn't surprise me if North Korea fell back into their regular habits and did a provocation after the election, because I think they would largely associate Biden with continuation of strategic patience, the years of Obama, and they would want to send an early signal that they're not standing for that. Right. And so, unfortunately, I think, you know, we could see provocations should Vice President Biden win.
Well, you know, John, Victor just mentioned that even in his lifetime, this is turning out to be the most critical election. And that's pretty, you know, pretty significant for Victor to say that. But, and I'm hearing something similar in Korea. So many people in Korea are saying the same thing. So, John, in which ways do you think the outcome of the election will impact South Korea most significantly? And there's a lot of things going on here.
Yeah. Well, you know, President Trump has been unusual in the way he's treated allies. You know, he has had a confrontational approach to allies, and that's just not in our historic norm. you know, I honestly, I think he feels that we're somehow giving a gift to Korea by having troops in Korea, and therefore you owe us something. And I think that's entirely wrong. We have troops in Korea because it's in America's interest to be forward deployed in Korea and to have Korea as an ally. I mean, it's such a precious thing for us, and he doesn't understand that. And so I think this is it's a profound choice. Now I will say, I think that, Trump is somewhat alone in his agenda. The base of the Republican Party doesn't have his naive optimism about North Korea. Frankly, some progressive left types have more support for this agenda than does the Republican Party or the centrist Democrats. So I think if Biden is elected, I do think it will go back to a more predictable pattern. But then the question is what does North Korea do? Do they try to stimulate something early on in a presidency and create a crisis? I think that's the concern that Victor has and that I share.
So Victor, if you were, the South Koreans as it relates to DPRK, who should South Koreans be pulling for when it comes to, the Biden presidency or the re-election of President Trump?
Well, it's a good question, and I think it depends on which South Korean you ask. I think being very frank, I think that when it comes to North Korea policy, if we're just talking about North Korea policy and diplomacy, prospects for diplomacy, I think many in the progressive camp would like to see a continuation of Trump. Because Trump, he's basically willing to pull out all the stops on North Korea. All the things that were taboo in negotiation, he's broken all those taboos. And I think, and I heard this from someone who's very close to Trump and the Trump campaign, is that if he wins, he's going to go for a fourth summit with Kim right away to try to finish the business that he couldn't really finish in Hanoi. Because as this person said, President Trump really went all in on North Korea. He took the issue on himself. He invested his personal time and capital and face in it, and it's a loose end from his first term in office. So I think he would want to go and do that right away. Now, that whatever deal he would try to make would not necessarily be one, frankly, that would make the peninsula more secure, because it may be not a very good deal from a denuclearization perspective. But nonetheless, it's possible that he would do something like that. So I think Koreans who want to see more diplomacy with North Korea and want to pick up the pieces of Singapore and Hanoi would probably want to see Donald Trump win again. But I think if there's any concern, if any Koreans are concerned about the overall welfare of the alliance, I mean, I think there's no denying that the alliance has really degenerated over the last 4 years, and that a Biden presidency, as John suggested, would be much more of a traditional, positive, forward-looking view about alliances with Korea, with Japan, with European allies and others, where the United States would see these as power assets and not power liabilities. I mean, I think Trump really sees them as the latter. And so to the extent that Koreans care about the alliance, I think they would probably want to see something that looks more traditional rather than the very transactional and, monetary based view of the alliance that Trump holds.
But at the same time, President Trump always talks about how, we've had relative stability between the South and the North. And now that, and this is a question for you, John, more than 2 years have passed since the Singapore summit. And based on what we know now, and I just said President Trump has said there's been limited missiles that are being shot today, minimal, you know, battles between the two countries, and we even had Kim Jong-un apologize on the burning of the person from South Korea back in North Korea. So, how do you evaluate the Trump administration's policy towards Korea? And is the election outcome going to make a big difference?
Well, certainly North Korea has held back in detonating nuclear weapons and launching long-range missiles, but they haven't held back on launching short-range missiles. They've really had a pretty aggressive program, to demonstrate that their missile technology is getting stronger and better. And they have basically been sending a signal to Seoul as well as to Tokyo that everybody's vulnerable. So they've held back from launching a missile that would attack the United States, but in their last national parade, they demonstrated a weapon that clearly has at least the kinetic capacity, to bring a warhead to the United States. So I don't think they have been holding back on their primary campaign of intimidation. I think they still have a campaign of intimidation, trying to both protect, I think part of it's to protect themselves, but also to try to intimidate us and you into making concessions, and so I don't think they've ended that. I on the point that you raised with this incident where a defector tried to return to North Korea and they killed him and then they burned his body. I found that very curious. It's normally dictators don't make public apologies for anything. They let the bureaucrats talk for them, or they announce that they punished somebody who was involved or something. They don't normally make an apology, personal apology. So this was unusual, and I think it must mean something, but I don't know what. And I do think that we should be studying this and trying to understand what it may mean. But the reality is that North Korea has really moved ahead quite aggressively with their missile program. So I think we should all be clear about that.
There's this conversation going here about, officially ending the war between the two, sides. So if President Trump becomes reelected, and this is for you, Victor, do you think there would be a lot of interest in formally ending the war? I guess we call it the end of war declaration. And when do you see him bringing this agenda to the table? Because I know during this stretch in the election, it has not been really prominently discussed.
Right. It has not been discussed in the election. I think in the last debate, there was probably less than 30 seconds devoted to Korea. So I think if Trump were to win, would he be interested in an end of war declaration? Absolutely. He would want to be able to say that he ended the war in Korea, and he would want to be able to say it's another endless war that he has ended. And with that, he would want to bring the troops home, I think. But the real question is it an end of war declaration that is just a piece of paper, or is it an end of war declaration that really ties the end of hostilities on the peninsula with a nuclear-free Korean peninsula? And unfortunately, I think it would be the former rather than the latter, because denuclearization is not something that's going to happen, in 6 months or a year. It's going to take some time. But an end of war declaration, and Trump doesn't have patience, so the end of war declaration, I think, would come pretty early on. as you know, one of these folks who were close to him said to me, he said, you know, he'll make a deal, and for experts like you, pointing to me, he says, you're probably not like the deal. But of course, he'll play it up as the best deal, you know, ever achieved. So now I know, because you know, nobody wants, certainly I can certainly empathize with that, but and perhaps, you know, an initial statement of intentions to end the war might be a good and positive. It really doesn't mean there's true reconciliation between North and South Korea. And both of those seem, you know, quite a long ways off right now. Not through any fault of South Korea, but because, as John said, the North Koreans have really taken advantage of the Singapore summit diplomacy for there to be a sort of lull in hostilities, but they have worked very hard to improve their capabilities. And they showed that in this last parade, where they showed, you know, the newest generation of the submarine launched ballistic missile, and then the newest ICBM, which possibly could have multiple re-entry vehicles on it. I mean, this is very clear signaling on the part of North Korea that they have a new capability, and that they will eventually test it. They will eventually test it at some point.
So what about under, you know, let's say a Biden administration? Wouldn't he also want to see an end of the war declaration as well, which is not too different from President Trump?
Go ahead, Victor.
For you, Victor, yes.
So yeah, I mean, I think he would. I think, like I said, I think the focus would first of all not be on North Korea. It would be on allies first. So the focus would be on consolidating the relationships with Seoul, Tokyo, Australia, others. And then I think there would be openness to continuing the negotiation diplomacy with North Korea, but not from the top down, not a summit at the top. It might be something that they would hold out at the end. And it would be a much more expert focused negotiation, much more traditional diplomacy, which I think the North Koreans would not. The South Korean government might also feel that that is too slow and might take too much time and looks too much like the failed efforts in the past. So, you know, an end of war declaration would certainly be a part of the incentives that might be on the table, even in a Biden administration. But whether that comes at the front end or the back end is not clear. The other thing I think we should acknowledge is that, absent the provocation by North Korea, North Korea is not going to be a high priority for a Biden administration. They will have so much to deal with, whether it's the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, the economy, climate change. They will have so many things on their plate that this will not be number one. For Trump, it was the number one issue when he came in, and Obama told him that it was the number one issue when he came in. And then North Korea did 20 ballistic missile tests and a hydrogen bomb test in Trump's first 12 months in office. So they made themselves the number one issue. But for Biden, it won't be the number one issue unless the North Koreans make it the number one issue by carrying out the provocations.
John,
could I just add one little to this, and that is,
of course,
as I mentioned, you know, the base of the Republican Party is not supportive of what Trump has been doing. So if Biden tried to lean forward in a positive way, he will almost instantly confront very strong criticism from Republicans in the Congress that he's being irresponsible. And historically, Democrats have been, you know, cautious not to look like they were weak on North Korea, because Republicans they condemn them, you know, for things. I think that would happen again. I think that if Biden, if he were to try to look like he was being soft in the early days with North Korea, he can almost guarantee intense Republican criticism. And so I think that would hold him back as well.
Very interesting. And hey, Victor, you kind of talked about trilateralism as well. We have a new leader in Japan. Obviously, the cooperation between Korea and Japan is really important to the U.S. So what kind of change can we expect under the new leadership of Japan as it relates to U.S. and Korea? And this is for you, John.
That's for John?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, for me. Well, I know Prime Minister Suga a little bit. I think he's different from Abe. I think Prime Minister Abe had an underlying feeling that Japan was the victim of World War II. And that, circumstances beyond Japan's control led to the war, and Japan did what it could, and then it had to live with a very unfair peace treaty, and so I think that was actually his underlying feeling. And he wanted to try to move Japan into a kind of a post, I would say post compliance world, into a new era. I don't know what Prime Minister Suga feels about these issues, but I don't think he has that same personal sentiment that Prime Minister Abe had. And Abe, he moved the country significantly, but I don't think he changed the basic framework that Japan has, which is, I don't think they feel comfortable being alone in the world. I think they want to be seen as being a responsible partner in the world. I think Suga-san will be the same way. So personally, I think that there's probably some opportunity to take the negative energy out of the relations between Korea and Japan. But Suga is also not necessarily going to be there for a long time. In many ways, he is there for a short period, whether he chooses to try to extend that. But, he's really there for a year now until they have their next elections. And I don't know, I have not met with him since he became prime minister. And whether he's stepping out and he's announcing his own pretty authoritative view. But I do think there might be an opportunity to work things, but it's going to take some time, and this is not something that the Trump administration has made a priority. They've not tried to make this a priority to kind of bring Korea and Japan into more of a working arrangement. So I think it'll be one of those questions that we'll see if Biden's elected. I do think Biden's team, I don't know about Biden personally, but I think the people that are likely to come into a Biden government are going to want to try to help create a better working arrangement, trilateral working arrangement.
And I think it's good to see, obviously the Indo-Pacific Alliance is taking up a lot of interest right now.
Yeah.
And we clearly need a very strong, trilateral relations between Korea, Japan, and the United States. So I remain hopeful that these two different alliances will get us one step closer to being even stronger.
Yeah.
But in Korea, Victor, and I'm sure you know this pretty well, this issue of military cost burden sharing continues to cast a major shadow over the U.S. Korea partnership. And I don't know what the answer is. The delta between what the Koreans pay today versus what President Trump has asked for is pretty sizable. So under President Biden or President Trump, what is your view on this specific matter?
So I think that these cost sharing or special measures agreement negotiations are always very difficult. I remember when I was in government, they were negotiating one of these when I was in government, and it was very difficult. And both sides got very angry at each other because, it was about real money. It was it wasn't about a mythical thing like denuclearizing North Korea. It was about actual dollars and cents. And so it was quite tough. But in the end, they always reached an agreement, and both sides were, they were happy once the agreement was reached, and everybody moved on. And to allow this thing to fester for 4 years like this and allow it to become the single impediment in the alliance is just such a travesty, from any way that you look at it. I think if Biden came into office, they would work very quickly to make an agreement right away. I think, and just to take it off the table. And the South Koreans were willing to offer, I think, as high as an 8% increase in previous negotiations, which is among the highest that they've given in the past. And so, I think that is. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing an agreement with that. I don't think the United States is losing if it makes an agreement like that. But I think it would be an important signal to send more broadly that that the United States is not looking at these alliances simply in transactional or profit-making terms. And as John said at the very beginning, I mean that the United States is in Korea because it's in U.S. interests. We're not in there just because it's in South Korea's interests, and therefore they get charged for that. I mean, that's just such a alien way to look at our alliance relationship. So I think they would, both as a symbol and practically speaking, want to sort of finish that right away so that they can move on to other more important issues.
Yeah,
could I just say, James, I think that not to get anybody in trouble, but most of the staff in the Biden administration, the Trump administration, think that Trump is wrong. They're trying to find a way to overcome what they consider to be a crazy and outrageous demand, and without getting in trouble with Trump or without embarrassing Trump. And so this has really gone quiet because, the professionals in the administration don't think it's sensible what Trump has personally been demanding, but they can't say that. So I think that I agree very much with Victor that I think the Biden administration will want to quickly step past it and find a sensible compromise that both sides can agree to, and not have this linger on, because this has been just a strange, weird peculiarity by a guy that used to try to intimidate the zoning commission of Atlantic City to give him a bigger hotel. This is cheap negotiating stuff. And, even his own government doesn't really agree with it, but they can't say it.
and I tell you, when I speak with both sides of the aisle in South Korea, the ruling party and the opposition party, I think this is one area that both sides seem to be kind of aligned on. And it's very sensitive, and I hope that we can get some positive closure, regardless of what happens in the election.
Yeah.
But now we talked a lot about North Korea. I want to move over on to talk about the China-U.S. relation, because that's also very important in Korea. The tension has reached a fever pitch right now. So how is the U.S.-China relations going to evolve under President Biden's administration, or under 4 more years with President Trump? Because Korea is in the sandwich mode, right? China is Korea's largest trading partner, but Korea also relies on the U.S. commercially, militarily, and also culturally. and Koreans are in this very precarious position. So your thoughts, John, would be very helpful.
Well, I'll start, and I think Victor should also comment on this. President Trump deserves credit for changing the popular sentiment about China to give a sense that China is a great challenge. So he deserves credit for that. The problem is he had no strategy. Imposing tariffs on Chinese products, I mean, that was a tax on Americans. That wasn't anything that punished China, And so he didn't have a strategy for it. I will say, I mean this very respectfully, I don't see a coherent strategy yet in the Biden campaign. I look at the artifacts of the Biden campaign, what they say in their website and things like this. And I honestly don't see a real strategy. I do think that they will, I do think that they will put a larger focus on the plight of the Uyghurs and human rights issues. But when you step back and say, what is your strategy, long-term strategy for dealing with a powerful country with a rising economy that is basically weaponizing its economy for political purposes? What's your strategy? And I don't see that in the Biden campaign yet. I think you will get what you see in the artifacts of the Biden campaign is, well, we need allies, and we're going to work closely with friends, and we're going to, diplomacy will be important and stuff like that. But I don't see a strategy yet. Now, Victor, you're closer to this. Your thoughts?
So a couple of things. I think the first is that the campaign has not lent itself to forcing either side. This speaks to John's point, to forcing either side to really challenge themselves to come up with strategies when it comes to dealing with China. There's a lot of China bashing, but everything is focused more on COVID and the domestic situation. And so for that reason, I think neither side really has been pushed to really try to think through what their strategies are going to be. I think at the same time, I think there's no denying that we are in this long-term competition with China, that and a Biden administration may not use the same language of a Trump administration and may not frame things in the same way, but in terms of substance, I think there still will be a focus on trying to have clean next generation wireless networks, diversifying supply chains, trying to maintain freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, all these sorts of things. And what this means for Korea is that on the one hand, I think there'll be a much better alliance because, as we said already, Biden would be much more traditional in terms of focusing on these alliances. But at the same time, it's going to force Korea to make some choices, choices that they don't want to make between the United States and China. And some of this could be on security issues like Hong Kong or South China Sea, but some of it could be on economic security issues like 5G, supply chains, pandemic, global health things of this nature. And I know that Korea, this is the last place they want to be in, is to have to choose between, as you said, James, their number one economic partner and their number one security partner. But I guess they can take consolation in the fact that they won't be the only ones in that position. There are a lot of countries that are in a similar position, Germany, Australia, there are many countries that are in this position. This is actually this is actually the next book I'm working on, is looking at sort of all of America's security partners, who their main trading partner is China, and these choices they have to make. And so I think that would certainly be the case under Trump, but I don't I think it would still be the case under Biden, and it's going to be difficult for Korea, but they're going to have to start making some of these choices because these choices will be forced on them.
So that's why, hey, Victor, the U.S. led the Clean Network Initiative. There's been a lot of, I don't want to use the word pressure, but suggestions for Korea to join this alliance, the network. So if you guys were advising the Korean government, how should they approach this choice or the type of decisions they need to make?
Victor, go ahead.
So I think on things like this, like Clean Network and supply chains, I think one of the things that we've learned from COVID, and it was always a trend in this direction, is that in the future, I think production will be reoriented around not just profit and efficiency, but resiliency of supply chains, even if it means paying a higher premium to achieve that. And nobody has to tell South Korea this. They have suffered enough at the hands of, as John said, China's weaponizing their trade. They've suffered enough at this, so no one has to explain this to Koreans. But I think what it does take is for the Korean government to understand that economic issues like this, whether we're talking about next-generation wireless supply chains in certain critical areas like PPE and others, are no longer simply economic decisions, right? And that the governments have to play a role. The Korean government has been very careful not to try to get too involved in the 5G question, but it's happening everywhere around the world, and the Korean government can't bury its head in the sand and say, well, it's a private sector decision, because in today's day and age, it's not anymore.
John, I know you want to say a couple of words on that as well.
Well, I think Victor highlighted a very, very important observation, and that is, for the last 30 years, globalization only had one dimension to it, which was lower prices for inputs. It only had one dimension. And I think what COVID has highlighted is that there is a resiliency dimension now that is just as important. So I think that businesses, and I talk to a lot of senior American, company leaders, and they are all rethinking what they're going to do. And it isn't just lowest price now. It's also going to be reliability of supply and minimizing disruptions that could come about, because I think people now see that this very finely engineered global transportation system has vulnerabilities to it. And so I think it's so this is an important dimension. But I would just like to go back to say, I don't think America should say to allies, either you're with us or you're with China. That's not a viable approach. No country in Asia can explicitly take a hostile approach to China. That doesn't mean that they aren't good friends of us or allies with us. And I do think that we have to enrich our own thinking here in the United States about how we're going to compete in the long term with China. I mean, the way we're going to compete in the long term is by having allies and having a predictable business environment that's good for everybody. And it's just, I think China will always, I hate to say it, they'll always adopt a policy that favors, the Chinese people. That's just their nature. And so I think we have an advantage, but it means we can't put friends like Korea in a position where you have to objectively and explicitly be an enemy of China. You're not going to do that. And I don't think we should force you to do that. I don't think it's smart to do that. And so I think we can, we just have to develop a more thoughtful way we're going to articulate a grand strategy. And I think there is one. I think this is not a hard problem to solve, but it does take allies, it does take objective, honest thinking.
I think, the way you explained it now is really, really well said. I know that Devin, our ambassador here always talks about U.S. and Korea as a rock solid alliance. So I remain optimistic that smart people will figure out the right solution, especially given what he just talked about.
Yeah.
But now let me just touch a little bit more about COVID in China. It seems like China is recovering nicely economically from COVID. But at the same time, I think their image, because so many people believe that this pandemic came from China, has tarnished its global image. So how do you think COVID will affect the balance of power between China and the U.S.?
Yeah, well, I'll start, and then Victor, please. We don't have a proud story to tell about COVID, because we've handled it so poorly. So even though we have, the President Trump wants to just blame it on China, the truth of the matter is that 40,000 people flew from China to the United States before he closed the border. I mean, so give me a break. I think that it's a rationalization after the fact, and we don't have a proud story to tell about it. Having said that, I think COVID presents an opportunity for us to try to start building networks that will improve global public health. There's no country in the world that has more to tell us about what to do than Korea. Korea has done a brilliant job. And, Korea ought to be in the forefront on an issue like this of helping to lead the global community to deal with pandemics. We're going to have another one. I mean, this one's not done. I mean, this one is going to be with us for 2 to 3 more years. We have to figure out how to distribute vaccines. We have to figure out how to make vaccines affordable in poor countries. How do we establish reliable, distribution systems and inoculation patterns? I mean, Korea should be a global leader on this, and we ought to be championing what you can teach us.
Well, as an American living in Korea now for around 16 years, I'm also really proud of what the Korean government has done.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating story, never been in lockdown so far. And as you can see from the background, beautiful day. People are going around, doing their normal business. And even American companies are doing so well here in South Korea. Take away the travel and tourism industries.
Yeah.
So I know, John, you talked about leadership from Korea. And Victor, we have, the current trade minister, Lee Myung-hee. She's a final candidate now for the position of Director General for the WTO. Another way Korea could possibly showcase its leadership. How do you forecast that contest and what the significance may be for Korea?
Well, it's impossible for me to forecast, but I think in terms of, it would be hugely significant for Korea, obviously. Korea is a middle power that has punched above its weight in multilateralism and in international institutions, whether you're talking about nuclear safety and security, the G20, green development, green growth development. Korea has overseas development assistance, Peace Corps. I mean, Korea has played such an important role, and for them to also have a Korean in this very important trade institution would be a huge and major accomplishment. I agree that Korea can play a role with regard to the pandemic. One of the interesting puzzles about the whole pandemic is that unlike almost every other crisis that has hit Asia, whether it's been a financial crisis or natural disasters, in the past, when these crises hit, there has been a tendency for the region to organize multilaterally to manage the crisis, whether it was the Asian financial crisis, currency swap agreements, things of that nature, or whether it was natural disasters and tsunamis where, you know, the region organized and created rapid disaster response, you know, stockpiling supplies, early warning tsunami. You know, they did all these things. But when it came to the pandemic, everybody was self-help. It was entirely beggar thy neighbor. And I don't blame that on Korea or Japan or others. I blame that on the United States, because all we needed to do was just do a little bit in terms of sort of pushing everybody towards building a coalition. And then I think countries like Korea and Japan and Taiwan and others who, you know, managed this very well would have taken on a much bigger role. On China, you know, I think both China and Russia are trying to use this pandemic and the sort of our chaos here in the United States to their advantage. You know, Russia's trying to peddle their Sputnik 5 virus around to different folks, and you know, and I think China is trying to tell a story about how they're sending PPE around the world. But if China actually comes up with a vaccine, do you think there is anybody who will take it outside of China? I mean, they'll be forced to take it inside of China. But do you think Korea would take a vaccine from China, given the history of, you know, contaminated products that have come from China, or the United States would? I mean, so, but my point here is to say that, you know, I think China is trying to take advantage, and Russia is trying to take advantage of the pandemic, but, you know, and what gains they may have will be temporary and short-lived. And the real test is something like, if they have a vaccine, is anybody going to trust what comes out of China? I think the answer is no.
Hey, you know, we have a couple of, you know, interesting questions from the audience. This is from Cisco. And this is a question for you, Victor. Can you elaborate on the traditional alliance between Korea and the U.S.? And is it even possible because of China's rising power?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, it fits very well with what we were talking about already. I mean, I think there's a lot more pressure now on U.S. allies and partners around the world to make these choices that the United States didn't used to force on other countries. You know, it's either us or it's them, and at least in my research on this, when we've pushed countries to make those choices, with the exception of Australia and Japan, right? With the exception of Australia and Japan, in the majority of cases, whether you're talking about 5G, Blue Dot Network, economic, you know, supply chains, these sorts of things, the majority of times our allies and partners have quietly accommodated China, right? That's not a record we want to continue to accumulate. So I think John is right. There's the broader framework is that there's still going to be competition, but the United States has to come up with a better strategy for how to do this, rather than simply coming in with a sledgehammer and saying it's either us or them. Right? That's not going to work.
And I have the last questions from the floor, and this is from one of your biggest fans, Jeff Jones, the chairman of the board of governors of AMCHAM. So obviously I need to ask his question. So his question is, what can and should we as businesses be doing to improve the relationship between U.S. and Korea?
Well, I think we're in an era of where economics is going to be a far, far bigger dimension of foreign policies. And right now, the business community really addresses foreign policy in a very narrow way. It only kind of comes in on transactional issues that have a direct impact on some important, thing, whether it's a tax deal or a trade deal or something. I think the business world needs to broaden its aperture to speak more widely about, about the positive trajectory of both Korea and America in this new era. First of all, the business community has far better understanding of what everybody's facing. There are some companies that they don't care. They're only after the quarter, good performance on this quarter. But I think most of the CEOs with whom I speak really have a much larger consciousness than that. And they know that, Korea and the United States champion constructive environmental conditions where business can prosper. And that's not the case in China. So I think having the business world through AmCham, I mean, you're a great voice for this, James. I mean, have the business world take a somewhat larger view about their voice in foreign policy. I think that would be a good thing. I would welcome it. I think we would all benefit from it because you have, better intelligence and insight about what you're facing. Now, on the other side, I would say the business world does have to adopt a larger vision than just quarterly performance. Now I can't speak to Korean companies, but in the United States, there's too narrow a focus on making the numbers for the quarter. And what we really need is to be promoting the conditions, where free enterprise environments can prosper. And I hope that there's a stronger and more engaged voice from the business world. And AmCham is the great voice for it.
Well, thank you for the nice plug on AmCham. We just have a couple of minutes left. And before I close, hey, Victor, I know that you've written many books and you have a new book coming up on the unification. Can you give us a quick preview?
What's the day?
Yeah. So yeah, it's going to happen someday. I mean, I think part of it is this idea that I think for many of the younger generation, all they know is South Korea. The division of Korea is just something they read about in history books. But as we all know, it's the biggest aberration in Korean history has been the division of the country, even though it's been very successful period for South Korea. So I think it's a broader look at the notion of a united Korea, and then also the potential of a future reunification, and the role that the United States and other countries friendly to Korea would play in seeing a reunified Korea prosper and thrive.
Okay. Well, Victor, the New York Times is moving a big part of their operation from Hong Kong to South Korea.
Yeah.
So we hope your book makes the New York Times top 10 bestseller report, okay? And if I have any influence, I will talk to these guys about it.
Yeah, appreciate it.
But just in closing, John and Victor, you guys have been just amazing today. The deep insights you offer is really, really invaluable to all of us. You have us at AmCham as permanent friends of CSIS, and I can hardly wait to see both of you in person again. It's been too long. So please stay safe. And thank you so much for all you're doing for all of us. Okay.
It's a privilege to be with you, James. Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Thank you
so much.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Take care now.